And then here's the exciting part. Those dopamine levels will remain elevated above baseline for hours afterwards before coming back down to baseline levels. And so there's no dopamine deficit state. Why? Because we did the work up front to get our dopamine. We got it indirectly, not directly. And so it's a potentially healthy source of dopamine.
I think a great jumping off point to make sure we're all on the same page here before we get into the nuances of dopamine is, first of all, talk about what dopamine is and how it reacts within the body.
Dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brains. It's essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation, especially as it operates in the specific pathway in the brain called the reward circuit. Dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation, but it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing drugs and behaviors. The more dopamine a drug or a behavior releases in our brains, and the faster it releases it, the more potential for addiction.
Okay, well, let's get into some of the nuances. Given we have the overview now, when does dopamine start to become a problem?
In order to understand the ways in which we can get into trouble with our dopamine, it's important to first understand that pain and pleasure are co-located in the brain, meaning that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine that there's a teeter-totter in your brain, like in a kid's playground, and that represents how we process pleasure and pain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. We get dopamine release in the reward pathway. When we experience pain, it tips the other. But there are certain rules governing this balance. The first is that the balance wants to stay level. And our brains will work very hard after any deviation from neutrality to reassert a level balance. So for example, if we do something pleasurable, we watch a Netflix movie, we watch a YouTube video, eat a cookie, smoke some cannabis, we get the release of dopamine in our reward pathway, and that balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than our brain will adapt to that increased dopamine by downregulating our own endogenous dopamine receptors and dopamine transmission, not just to baseline level, but below baseline level. This is called neuroadaptation. I like to imagine this as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it there, so they stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, the after effect, that moment of wanting to watch yet another TikTok, even in the middle of the TikTok that we're watching now. Now, if we wait long enough, those gremlins will hop off and homeostasis will be restored and that urge will go away. But the inclination when we're in that dopamine deficit state to want to reach for another hit of our drug in order to restore the balance or even get another high is very, very strong. And if we get into that impulse and we repeatedly expose our brains to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors over time, what happens is we accumulate more and more gremlins on the pain side of the balance until they're camped out there. And when that happens, we've entered addicted brain. Now we're in a kind of chronic dopamine deficit state where we need more of our drug in more potent forms, not to get high, but just to feel normal and level the balance. And when we're not using, we're walking around with our balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use our drug, otherwise known as craving.
Well, it's interesting because obviously you took it to the chronic case and talked about it from an acute case as well, which I'm happy we did. But either case, there's this negative feeling we're going to have to go through when we do something pleasurable. So I can see how somebody, this is all brand new to them. It could sound kind of scary. It's like, I want to watch a Netflix program. It's Friday night. I want to watch a nice documentary with my loved ones, but I'm going to have to suffer because of that.
What I would ask people to begin to pay attention to in order to appreciate how this works in our brain is the way that we feel when we're in the middle of our drug, and then that feeling of falling away as soon as it ends. So that moment that the movie ends or the Netflix episode comes to an end and that next episode button comes up and we promised ourselves, that we would just watch one episode, but there we are with that feeling of restlessness, discomfort, a little bit of dysphoria. We want to be back in that space of forgetting, of escape, of the dopamine rush, essentially. And the pull to do that is very strong, not just because it feels good, but because in the aftermath of increased dopamine, we have decreased dopamine. And it's not just decreased to baseline, it's decreased below baseline. And that creates that incredible drive to want to repeat the behavior, which seems really unfair. Like, why can't we just go back down to baseline? Like, why did Mother Nature make our brains do that? But if you think about, the ways in which that kind of ancient wiring keeps us all seeking and striving, it makes a lot of sense if you remember that for most of human existence, we lived in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is not the world that we live in now. But in a world of scarcity, we have to be constantly looking for the next best thing in order to survive. And so what happens, in addiction is that we confuse our drug with something that we need to survive.
Well, let's take that even further. You talked about, the evolutionary benefit of this and how we've evolved, and this has been something that's helped us. Let's fast forward to today, the 21st century, and talk about how that ancient wiring, given today's world, is setting us up for failure, basically.
Yeah, that's the central problem, right? That, the progress that we've made in terms of science, technology, all the incredible innovation, the eradication of disease, the potentiation of pretty much every reinforcing substance and behavior, the creation of drugs that didn't exist before, social media, video games, online forms of old drugs like pornography, have made all of those drugs more potent, more ubiquitous, easier to access, more novel. And if you look at those four features, quantity, frequency, and potency, and novelty, those are the things that make something really addictive, right? Like TikTok never, ever runs out. If you had as much cocaine as there was TikTok, we'd have a lot more people addicted to cocaine. So that's essentially the problem, that, this ancient wiring is mismatched for this modern ecosystem where almost every human behavior and substance has become potentiated, drugified, made addictive. I talk in the book about the way that I became addicted to romance novels. And I do that to draw an analogy between myself and people with severe sex and pornography addictions, to normalize it on some level and admit that we're all kind of on this addiction spectrum, without, hopefully trivializing people with severe and life-threatening addiction. But also to emphasize that, even those behaviors like reading, which as a culture we have typically associated with something that's like healthy and good for your brain, has now, become something that's actually potentially addictive because of the sheer quantity of romance novels, right? The ease of access 24/7 on a Kindle or other device, the ways in which the publishing industry has figured out how to make every kind of storytelling more potent, ending it on a cliffhanger, so that you feel compelled to keep going. There's no kind of natural resting point. The same thing with social media and a lot of online activities, news, like there's no those bottomless bowls. We have a desire to finish things, and yet we can't do that anymore because the quantity is absolutely unlimited. All of this conspires to make all of us, more vulnerable to the problem of addiction.
And what about the idea of different addictions where somebody might say, okay, my life feels pretty in control. I'm reading one romance novel a month. I'm playing one video game every couple days. I'm smoking cannabis just on the weekend. But when you add all these up,
right.
And then there's that overlap of the addiction, but through different means, how does that all facilitate together and lead to, I guess, a more massive singular addiction? Or is there any connection there?
No, that's a really great point. So we're seeing more and more of that clinically what I think you could call polypharmacy or polydrug use, where, I'll have patients say, well, I only smoke pot once a week. It's like, okay, well, what are you doing on the other days? Well, I only binge drink once a week. I only snort cocaine once a week. I only use porn. It's like at the end of the day, you're pulsing your reward pathway with something every single day. And, the final common pathway, again, of all reinforcing drugs and behaviors is this release of dopamine in this reward circuit. And this constant pulsing of our reward pathways, I think, has the potential to put all of us, in this dopamine deficit state, which doesn't just speak to the problem of addiction. It also speaks to the problem of anxiety, depression, and suicide. And the rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide have been going up steadily over the past 30 to 50 years, especially in rich nations. So if you look at, for example, suicide rates and you correlate that to the socioeconomic level of the country, what you will find is that the richest countries in the world have more people who are depressed, anxious, and ending their own lives, which is a complete paradox, right? You would think that, these are the wealthy countries, people have everything they need, they should be happier, yet global happiness surveys do the same thing. They show that the least happy people are people living in the wealthiest nations, and that they're also, if you track happiness over the past 20 years, happiness has gone down more steeply in places where people have gotten richer. So I think you're absolutely right that it's this kind of this pulsing of our dopamine reward pathway through all these small and subtle ways, from the moment that we wake up and touch our smartphone, drink our coffee, all the way to our, shows that we watch at night. It's ultimately changing our hedonic set point, our ability to experience pleasure. We need more and more potent forms to get any joy at all. And when we're not using a drug of any kind and we're just sort of sitting there, not listening to music, not watching something, not on our computers, not on our phones, we feel very restless and anxious because we're in a dopamine deficit state.
Given this is so nuanced and there is so many different sources that we can, accumulate dopamine and get to this state of where it becomes unhealthy, how does somebody begin to assess where they're at on that continuum? They might feel good, but they might be headed in a bad direction, or they don't even realize, and they are, in a position where they need to start working back before it becomes a major problem. Basically, how do we begin to assess where we're at currently when it comes to dopamine?
I think the best way to assess our relationship with dopamine is to actually give up our drug of choice for long enough to see what happens with neuroadaptation, with the gremlins, with our dopamine firing. A lot of times, we can have the sense that our drug use, and I use that term drug very broadly, isn't impacting us adversely until we try to give up our drug and then actually experience the subtle signs and symptoms of withdrawal. We realize just how difficult it is. And then especially if we're able to abstain for long enough, which in my experience is usually on average about a month, how much better we feel having eliminated that substance from our lives for a period of time. Because the truth is, when we're chasing dopamine, it's very hard to see true cause and effect. It's hard to see the way that this drug impacts our lives. The world is sensory rich and causal poor. So we are not good judges of, how one donut a day that tastes really good in the moment might be contributing to weight gain, a month hence. So one of the ways to get that clarity is actually to eliminate that drug from our life for long enough to be able to observe ourselves and our reaction and to come out the other side.
Given today's world, it seems like this is something that, we can't just assess and act accordingly in a moment's time, but because it is so dynamic and the world is changing so quickly, I'm assuming the first step is to be tuned in through a conversation like this or your book. And then the second step is to evaluate on a regular basis, because these are such slippery slopes. And there are so many of these high dopamine stimulators that are so accepted by society these days that it could be so easy just for any of us. And I'm glad you mentioned your story with the romance novels, because it shows that even somebody who is in this world and is so aware of how the brain works, none of us are immune.
Oh, that's for sure. I mean, as I like to say, if you're not addicted yet, it's coming soon to a website near you. Yeah, so that tuning in is a really, I use this dopamine acronym where D stands for data, and data refers to, that's where we have a really frank look at what we're consuming, how much and how often. And we might write it down on a piece of paper. We might tell another human being. But that alone is a really important, and potentially aha moment to actually realize, what we're doing. It's very easy to sort of like blur our eyes and not really focus on our consumption and thereby minimize it in our minds to ourselves and others. But when we force ourselves to actually focus on it and be really honest about what we're doing, then we get clarity on it. So, for example, I will often, with patients who are drinking alcohol, if I just ask them, do you drink alcohol? They'll say, yeah, I do. I said, how much do you drink? And they'll say, oh, I just drink a couple of drinks, a couple times a week. So then, that's a sort of a vague estimation and it seems really benign. But if I do something called the timeline follow back method, where I go every day, starting from today, working backwards, I say, okay, well, what did you drink yesterday? Well, yesterday I had 2 glasses of wine with dinner. Okay, what did you drink the day before? The day before I had a glass of wine and a gin and tonic. Okay, what did you have before? Well, that was a party. I probably had 4 beer. Anyway, you keep going like that. And what you discover then, doing it that way, when you really focus on it one day at a time, is that person had 21 drinks in a week, right? And so when we do that clinically, patients will themselves say, "Oh my gosh, like I hadn't realized it was that much, or I hadn't realized it had gotten out of hand like that, or that's a lot. I guess I hadn't realized." And so that's really important. That happened even recently to me. I was watching a YouTube video of like a sporting event, and my daughter came over and she said, "Mom, you're always watching YouTube." I said, "No, I'm not. I never watch YouTube." And she goes, "Oh, no, lately I've noticed you're always watching YouTube." And so she left, and I was kind of like grumbling to myself, that's not true. But then that forced me to stop and think, okay, well, how long have I been on YouTube right now? Oh, it's been an hour. Who knew? I thought it was 5 minutes. How much was it yesterday? Well, it was probably an hour yesterday. The day before, I probably, and then I added up and it's like, oh yeah, I probably watch 10 to 15 hours of YouTube a week, or I have been, right? And so this kind of slippery slope phenomenon, not really focusing on it. But then once we quantify it in that way, it really does come into relief. And we're like, oh, wow. Yeah, I don't want to spend, my life watching YouTube. That's not how I want to spend my time, and then comes some of the motivation to change.
Well, one thing that's really interesting, and I touched on this before, is the fact that certain activities are socially acceptable. So like the YouTube one, that could have probably easily been passed off and your daughter not mention anything because, that seems harmless. Or drinking alcohol, you mentioned. These are things that society accepts. And when it comes to certain ones, such as working too much, we even praise that. Or certain people that are involved in sports at a high level and they're practicing all the time and it can become an obsession. But then when it comes to things like cocaine and heroin, all of a sudden we're all on the same page. And if it's somebody in our life that we know is using those things, it becomes crisis mode. Right. So it's interesting. There's this extra layer is what I'm getting at, where unfortunately for people that fall under the activities that are socially acceptable, they're going to be less likely to get help.
Right, or even less likely to have it recognized as a problem. And I think workaholism is really such an important example, because work too has become drugified, right? The way in which we now there's no stopping point to work, right? So it's more plentiful. The access is 24/7 because we can all work from wherever. Work has been made more potent with things like bonuses, especially people who work in white-collar jobs, who are now, historically working more hours than ever before. So, people in white collar jobs today are working many more hours than people who had white collar jobs in the 1950s. People in sort of blue collar work today are working less than people who worked in the 1950s. In the 1950s, the amount of time spent in work in both blue collar and white collar jobs was about the same, and that's not true anymore. And part of that is because white collar work has been drugified with bonuses and stock options and all of these incentives that make working more seem like something very, very enticing. Whereas blue collar work, many people have dropped out of those jobs because they're sort of mind-numbing, difficult jobs to do in some instances, and there's been a huge exodus of young men out of the workforce because of video games. So this has been documented more and more, especially young men spending not just their leisure time, but actually dropping out of the workforce and playing video games. So you have this funny dichotomy, where a work has definitely become a drug and workaholism is a growing problem among certain segments of society. And then you've got other segments of society who are dropping out of the workforce, have more leisure time, and then are consuming these other highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors. So it's sort of wherever you turn.
And this ties back to what we were talking about before, where if somebody's a workaholic, they're going to be, stimulating dopamine all day, working. And then maybe their activity, quote unquote, to relax when they get home is to put on YouTube or have, a beer or alcoholic beverage. And then it just layers on these dopamine stimulating behaviors, one on top of the other.
Yeah, so that's a really insidious narrative, this whole work hard, play hard idea. People, really do push themselves all day long beyond what their minds and bodies can safely and comfortably do. Sometimes maybe that's even accompanied by stimulant use in the form of, medication stimulants or just lots of caffeine or nicotine or what have you. And, the body and mind can really only do so much, and then it exhausts itself. But then instead of letting our bodies rest and not pushing our bodies so hard, what we do then is at the end of the workday, to reward ourselves and compensate for overdoing it, we then imbibe, intoxicants in all its forms, Netflix binge, food, drugs. So now we've got, where you're pressing on the pleasure side, pressing on the pain side. And one of the things that happens when we deviate from homeostasis is that we trigger our body's own stress response. So you get a huge adrenaline response from this kind of work hard, play hard type of lifestyle, and it's not sustainable.
Let's get more into details of the addiction piece. From, earlier in our conversation when it came up, the way I'm understanding it is addiction is basically along this dopamine continuum, but when you get to the more extreme piece of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a spectrum disorder. We define addiction as the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. It's associated with these physiologic manifestations of dependence, tolerance, withdrawal. In other words, a pleasure-pain balance that's gradually getting weighted to the side of pain and entering this kind of chronic dopamine deficit state, such that now the drug is needed just to feel normal. And when we're not using, we're in a kind of subthreshold or frank withdrawal. But the motivational and reward circuit that gets sort of engaged and goes awry in addiction is a circuit that we all have and that we need to survive. It's the reflexive way in which we approach pleasure and avoid pain. And as such, we're all potentially vulnerable to the problem of addiction with enough of our drug of choice and other circumstances conspiring. I really think that anybody could become addicted. And, speaking of drug of choice, that's an important concept because what might release a lot of dopamine in my brain might not release a lot of dopamine in your brain and vice versa. We all have our different drugs that we like. But one thing that's also true is that now we have new drugs that didn't exist before. So those sort of groups or people that were previously thought to be relatively immune to the problem of addiction, like people who don't particularly respond to the traditional legal drugs of nicotine, cannabis, alcohol, Now we've got folks who are getting addicted because they're getting addicted to romance novels. They're getting addicted to social media. They're getting addicted to pornography. They're getting addicted to online chess. They're getting addicted to cryptocurrency, right? They're getting addicted to work. So it's the drugification of all of these aspects of our lives, kind of creating just a larger net to catch people up in this process.
And when it comes to addiction, how much of it would you say is environmental versus genetic? And I know there's a lot of variance there, and that's a really complex question. But just to go there, at least briefly, let's talk about your opinion on that.
Well, I mean, the data suggests that about 50% of the risk is genetic and about 50% of the risk is environmental, experiential, contextual. So the genetic piece is based mainly on family studies showing that if you have a biological parent or grandparent with alcohol addiction, you are at increased risk to become an alcoholic yourself, even if raised outside of that alcoholic home. And so those are pretty powerful data to me. Suggesting that there's this inborn or innate vulnerability to addiction. And I've also treated many people, and most people have met people who just seem to have what used to be called the addictive personality, which is a term that we don't really use anymore. We now use sort of the disease of addiction language, but just this idea that some people are so vulnerable to the problem of addiction that they could get addicted to anything. So, for example, way back when, early in my career, I had a woman who was in recovery from an alcohol addiction, but she actually then got addicted to water because she discovered that if she drank enough water, she could make herself hyponatremic and altered, and so she would do that. So again, this idea that, even in the absence of this person's drug of choice, this person is so vulnerable to this addiction manifestation or phenomenology that they could get addicted to just about anything. Like, to me, water really captures that just about anything idea. Whereas other people might not be so vulnerable to the problem of addiction. This idea that most of us are now struggling with compulsive overuse of our devices and digital content, but we can kind of see it happening and we can sort of do some self-correction and sort of move on. It doesn't reach the threshold of like actually interfering with our health, our goals, our relationships, our values. We're not like, going outside of our moral compass to find time to check our phones, right? I mean, most of us are not doing that, but there is a subset of people who is struggling with that. So I think it's important to, acknowledge that this environmental risk has increased because of the increased access in the modern world to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, including drugs that didn't exist before, as well as increased potency of old drugs. So, for example, cannabis is much more potent today than it was, 40, 50 years ago. Opioids are much more potent than they were 200 years ago. Nicotine products are more potent and more available and come in all kinds of different delivery mechanisms compared to, even cigarettes 150 years ago. So
let's take that cannabis example and take it to the extreme where somebody's been using cannabis for years on a regular basis. It's clear by most that this person is addicted to that substance. So they've been using it, they've been getting their dopamine stimulation. They've needed more over time to get that same stimulation. Let's talk about working their way back. Let's give people hope that have pushed it to that limit. And you alluded to something earlier where the brain can over time work its way back. So let's go from addicted brain back to quote unquote normal brain and talk about what that process looks like when people start to wean off of whatever they're addicted to.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, there's lots of hope. People are recovering from addiction all the time. There are millions of people all over the world in long-term recovery from addiction, leading really rich and wonderful lives and making amazing contributions, to the world and to their families and friends and et cetera. So lots of reason for hope. if you think about it from the perspective of the biology or the neurocircuitry, the first step is to restore a level balance or homeostasis. Because when people are in this constant state of craving, it's really impossible to be able to have the energy and focus to do much of anything else in our lives. So one of the obvious ways to restore a level balance is to abstain from our drug of choice for long enough for our body to get the memo that it needs to start upregulating its own endogenous dopamine production and get levels, baseline levels of dopamine firing back to normal. And so that is really where we start with many patients, is that we ask them to abstain from their drug of choice for long enough, which is usually to start a month, for dopamine reward pathways to reset themselves. Now, a couple caveats. We would not ask somebody who had tried repeatedly to stop on their own and was unable to do this. We would want to support that person with a higher level of care, for example, a residential treatment facility where they didn't have access to their drug for at least 30 days so that they could get their brain back online. We also wouldn't ask this of somebody who was at risk for like a life-threatening alcohol or benzo withdrawal. But for somebody with a cannabis addiction, you can safely stop, and withdrawal is not life-threatening. It can be really uncomfortable, but it's not life-threatening. Same thing with a pornography addiction or a video game addiction, which, by the way, is often characterized by physical symptoms of withdrawal. People don't really appreciate that, but people can have real physical pain with those behavioral addictions when they stop. But whatever it is, we ask folks to stop, knowing that initially they'll feel worse before they'll feel better. They'll go into withdrawal. But if they can just abstain for long enough, i.e. 3 to 4 weeks, typically that is enough time for the beginning of a reset reward pathway. And when that happens, it's really exciting because people are then begin to have the sense of being freed from the constant intrusive cravings of wanting to use. They're also able to experience pleasure from more modest rewards, dinner with friends, watching a sunset, going for a walk, things that we lose the ability to take pleasure in when we're in our addiction, because what happens is our focus comes very narrowly upon just our drug of choice. And that's the only thing that we want to do and the only thing that gives us pleasure. So you get this widening again of the lens with abstinence and the ability to do other things and activities without using our drug and to actually enjoy them. And so I think that's a key message for patients. Patients really feel like, well, either I'm going to be using my drug, which is, eventually makes everybody miserable, but it's either that or I stop using and I'm going to be miserable. I'd rather use and be miserable. So what I always try to tell people is it's not just between being miserable using or being miserable not using. There's this third option where you can come out of this place of misery if you can, abstain for long enough. I also want to just add that, for opioid addiction, we often use opioids to treat opioid addiction. And what we're doing there is we're not like giving our patients opioids so they can go get high. We're basically acknowledging that some people just simply may not be able to abstain for long enough to reset reward pathways, or maybe that balance is broken. Maybe no amount of abstinence is actually going to restore homeostasis for some individuals. So when we're using things like methadone maintenance, what we're doing is we're giving them a medication that allows them to reset reward pathways so that they can then begin to engage in other types of recovery work.
As you talk about using a drug there as a means of overcoming an addiction, it gets me thinking about supplements and natural things that we could give patients. I'm curious, are there any natural, nutritive supplements that can be helpful when somebody is coming off an addiction?
I don't know anything about supplements. I'm just going to say that up front. I didn't learn about supplements in medical school, don't use them in my clinical practice. Haven't read the evidence on them one way or another. So I'm not informed about supplements.
And I can imagine as somebody, if you're working with a patient and they are, again, working out of an addiction, one thing you'd have to be really wary of is making sure they're not, subbing that cannabis out and then finding that dopamine high through a video game. I can imagine a lot of people, whether they're conscious or not, it would be easy enough to substitute out one addiction for another.
Yeah, so this is something that we always have to counsel patients about as they give up their drug of choice, particularly if they're using other drugs simultaneously, which is common. So we'll have patients who both drink and smoke cigarettes. And many times they are willing or wanting help with stopping drinking because drinking has interfered in more obvious ways in their relationships, in their work, and in their parenting or what have you. But like they don't want to give up smoking, right? Or they don't feel able to. And that's okay because you can still get the benefits of just giving up one drug, even if you're continuing to use another, as long as you don't increase use of that other drug. So we have to talk a lot about cross addiction and how about all drugs like basically work on the same common reward pathway. So if you're going to give up alcohol but keep smoking, you don't want to increase your consumption of cigarettes or cannabis or whatever it is, or you don't want to add in something else like a cookie or start binge watching Netflix or video games, right? Because of this potential for cross addiction.
And as a parent yourself, given where we're at in the 21st century with all these different behaviors and substances that can spike our dopamine, what would you suggest to parents out there if they're tuning in right now and they're, maybe they're just learning about this, but they have kids that are still under their care and they want to guide them in a healthy way, not in an overbearing way, but in a way to provide them with the information and give them an idea of some of the pitfalls that they need to be wary of. How have you done that with your kids?
Well, I mean, what I counsel to parents was, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's a really challenging world to raise kids in and for kids to grow up in because of these sort of 24/7, temptations and the constant way in which we're being invited to consume in an addictive way. But I generally, advise parents that that first decade of our kids' lives is a decade when we do have control over what they consume. And so it's very important to manage and monitor that, including screens, and that generally kids should not have their own screens and unfettered access to screens, that if they're going to be on a screen, we should limit the amount of time, we should limit the frequency, and we should know what they're doing and make sure that we're monitoring that. I think that's really, really important because screens and the digital content that they deliver, those are drugs and they're highly reinforcing for the brain. And if our kids get too much of them, they can potentially fall into this kind of dopamine deficit state where then every time they come off of the screen, and parents will describe that, and I've seen this with my own kids, they're irritable, they're anxious, they're depressed, they want to go back onto the screen, and they're not willing to engage, in the family life. They're, angrier, they're less civic-minded. I mean, I think these things really genuinely are a product of over-engagement with this virtual world and the digital content. So really, really, not just monitoring, but also actually limiting the time that our kids spend on screens, making sure we're modeling as parents what we want our kids to do. So we can't be on our screens constantly, interrupting conversations that we're having checking our phones. If we want our kids, to have a different kind of behavior, we have to really exhibit the type of behavior that we want our kids to have. And then really encouraging other healthy coping strategies or other healthier ways of getting dopamine. So sports, as long as it's not too extreme. There is this problem in our culture where now, kids' sports have almost become like its own kind of, hedonic treadmill. Getting together and playing board games, being in nature, solving problems without going online. Talking things through, being fully present, having times and spaces that are tech-free, like a tech-free day of the week, a digital Sabbath, tech-free vacations, tech-free meals. So these are really being thoughtful about how we're consuming. And then also acknowledging once our kids get to be teenagers, in my opinion, we don't have control anymore. And so we still want to engage them in dialogue about how to be a responsible user of the internet. If we observe them, in doing things that we think are dangerous or that look addictive. We want to reflect that back to them. But, at some point in their teenage years, going on into adulthood, they're going to have to sort it out. I guess the caveat there is that, kids are different, and some kids are going to be able to manage their consumption with some guidance, and some kids are really going to get into trouble. And those kids who get into serious trouble, they need help, and in some cases, professional help. So I think that's important to acknowledge too.
It's interesting as you explain this, it almost seems like the way the world's set up in the 21st century, we need to counteract the fact that these companies, I'm sure, through advertising and through social media, are using the same science that you're talking about today to pull us in. And we need to be aware and use that to counteract what's being thrown at us.
So important, right? I mean, this is with intention that this digital content has, it's been made and engineered to be addictive. And we are getting sucked in. And it's really easy to just sort of laugh it off or say it's no big deal, or to imagine that we have control where we really don't. I think highlighting this, the pernicious way in which the artificial intelligence and the algorithms learns us, knows what we like, suggests things, the alerts, chases us down. I mean, it's terrible. Even when people want to avoid being on social media or other, digital platforms, they're pulled back in. So I think really acknowledging how we have to put up barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice. We have to create this world within a world. We have to consciously and with intention, not just individually, but also collectively, work to combat a world which is seeking to get us addicted.
And it's interesting because as people, in a general sense, the people we look up to in the world, whether they be, professional athletes or musicians, these are often people that have taken their obsession and taken it to an extreme where it's worked out for them, where they've been able to make a career and make a living doing these things. But if we, as, even adults and kids are idolizing that, we need to almost take a reframe on that and what we're looking at as our positive influences.
Yeah. It's really interesting because this kind of striving for individual success has become such a dominant mode of our culture. And it's also part of the hedonic treadmill, chasing dopamine, right? All those external accolades, whether we're an athlete or an actress or a politician, it's a definite high when you get an award or you win a race or you get elected or whatever it is. But of course, for those individuals, dopamine runs out for them too, right? You win a gold medal and then it's like, then what? Then you got to get 2 gold medals. And then no matter how many medals you win, it doesn't work anymore because of the nature of pleasure and pain and the way we adapt to any pleasure, and it becomes fleeting and ultimately followed by pain. So, so you've got that issue. Then you've got the ways in which we are, so many of us in our culture, spectators of winners. So part of what we do and the way that we get high is we sort of follow these people, these champions, and we become their fans and we live vicariously through them. And then, our drug becomes those people, and talk about pressure on them. Like, then they better keep it going, right? Because now they have all these people who are relying on them to get their hit of dopamine. So it is like, it's like this, it's terrible. I'm not going to say the analogy I'm thinking of, but it's basically just like this, this continuous circle of using each other to get high. And I think that's really a pernicious aspect of modern culture. The ways in which we, even unconsciously, are objectifying other people as a means to our own end. And our own end is, this glorification of the self. which, by the way, I speculate that on the natural heels, I speculate that on the heels of narcissistic self-aggrandizement, which is what our culture pushes us toward, that the natural counterbalance to that is shame and self-loathing. One of the things that I've seen more and more of in my patient population, but also in the students that I teach, and frankly, in my own self, is an increase in self-loathing. And I think it's a function of being caught in this trap of narcissism and self-aggrandizement and the focus on the self and self-achievement. Because I don't think that we were really meant to do that, right? It's kind of this sort of an adulteration of what, a healthy community should look like. And I do think, like, whenever I personally feel sort of shame and self-loathing, I try now to trace it back to self-aggrandizement and narcissism, because I do think that that's where it comes from, right? That again, if you think of this pleasure-pain balance analogy, you could think of it as the narcissism shame balance as well. That the way that our brain naturally corrects for ego and self-aggrandizement is to put us into this shame place before coming back to a healthier level position. And I really do think that that's what's going on. So the antidote to that, just like, the antidote to addiction, is to not strive for that sort of success and accomplishment in the first place, and to recognize that if we're caught up in that, there's a huge psychological cost and a price that we pay. And that price is this come down from the high of that, which I think is this experience of shame.
You hear it time and time again, probably again because we're so connected and there's so many different inspirational videos and things being shared online, that when you get the big goal that you've been working hard towards, whatever that is, we don't have to get into the specifics, that the fulfillment and happiness that you're going to have when you get there, it typically isn't there. So what I'm getting at from a dopamine perspective, let's talk about the climb, working towards that goal, what's happening with dopamine, and then when we get there and we have that sense of not feeling what we thought we'd feel.
Right. Well, I think, what really matters is whether we're doing the task because the task, gives us a sense of meaning and purpose and is consistent with our values and part of how we define our role and mission in our lives, versus whether the task is intentionally engaged in to get a particular feeling or to get a dopamine hit. And those things, you can be doing the same actual activity, but if you're orienting on it in the first way versus the second way, it's going to be a very different experience. And I think, the psychopathology comes in when we're orienting toward the task as a means to an end to essentially get high. Even if we're not even recognizing that, is what we're doing, then we're in trouble, because then no matter how much we get, it's ultimately not going to work, right? The brain's going to adapt. It will be less and less pleasure. Over time, we'll get that dopamine deficit state. Then we'll feel more and more compelled to get even more. And it's Sisyphus, pushing that boulder up the hill and having it fall down again and again. So instead, I think, a better orientation is, and this is really hard, especially for like younger people. It's easier as you get older, but to not necessarily be looking for dopamine. Like, it's so amazing when you think about how we really orient our whole day on our little rewards. I'm going to exercise and then I'm going to have my coffee, right? Or I'm going to, do this in the morning and then I'm going to take myself out to lunch or get my donut or treat myself with a movie or whatever. I mean, we're constantly, I'm going to do this thing and then I'm going to get my reward. It's like our whole entire lives have been bracketed by this sort of reward seeking. And I find it a really interesting exercise to just go through a single 24-hour period, not anticipating a single reward. So for example, either not having the reward or not like looking forward to it, not saying, well, when I'm done with this, the pain of doing this is going to end with my rewarding myself with this. And instead be like, you know what? I'm not going to have any rewards today. This whole day is going to happen in a way that is not going to be bracketed by any reward, any kind of instance of like intoxication or pleasure or escape. And it's very interesting to me when we do that. It really changes our whole orientation on this moment in time. Because if I'm not actively looking forward to a reward, then I'm not looking forward. And if I'm not looking forward, I'm really here, right? Because there's no other place to be. And all of a sudden, you get a very, very different kind of experience of your day. And so I think that can be really instructive for people to kind of learn to be in this space where they're present without that anticipation of a future reward.
And now that we have a good idea of how dopamine works and where different areas of potential addiction are, social media, we'll use this as an example. It's come up a couple times. This is something that we all face. We got to figure out what in the 21st century our quote unquote healthy relationship with that will be, unless we opt out like yourself, which is another option.
Right.
But given that we now understand how this works in the brain with dopamine, how can we go about setting up healthy barriers, whatever those are, physical barriers, time barriers, things we can put in place, understanding what we understand now ahead of time to interact with something like social media in a healthy way?
So these are what I call self-binding strategies, and they're really important for helping us manage our consumption. If we only rely on our willpower, we will not be successful because willpower runs out. Instead, what we need to do is anticipate that offered our drug, desire will be intense, and we will have to exercise an enormous amount of willpower to refuse it. And so much better to kind of create a world within a world where we're not constantly being tempted. And this can be done with social media or with other digital content, in a variety of ways. We can use time as a self-binding measure and limit the amount of time on any given day, or say we're only going to use, during these windows of time, or I'm only going to go on my phone or whatever after I've finished another task. So we can make these kind of metaphorical finish lines that we have to cross before we use our drug. We can do things like schedule our Instagram time or our Facebook time. So we say to ourselves, okay, I am going to go on and do social media, but I'm going to do it, for this discrete time period, set an alarm, make a commitment to ourselves and to others to make sure, that we try and keep that. We can use actual physical barriers where we have tech-free spaces or where we don't have easy access to either the app or the web platform or the device itself. We can use in accountability spaces where we're using with others who can help us keep in check our use or help us self-observe that we've gone over time. We can use categorical barriers. So, for example, I had a patient addicted to video games who realized that he just couldn't play League of Legends once he started that. He couldn't stop. But there were other video games, especially if he just played it with his friends, that he was better at then limiting the time. So I think, and I will say too, none of these self-binding strategies, in my experience, work without first a period of abstinence from our drug to reset reward pathways. So you've got to abstain first, reset reward pathways, and then come up with this very specific plan going forward with a reset dopamine balance, right? Because if you're just still in that dopamine deficit state, when you enter the experiment of trying to limit your use, it's impossible.
And when it comes to something like video games or social media where there's no specific benefit that somebody is necessarily getting from those, they're getting their dopamine hit and their pleasure and having fun, but we talked about how you're off social media. How often would that be the ideal in these situations? Because you could even argue that things like video games, you could get that pleasure from better means. What I'm getting at is when we realize the science and how this is working on our brains, is there really a point in things like video games anymore? Are we just putting a Band-Aid on by trying to put up barriers when we can live a more fulfilling, happy life just abstaining from them altogether?
Well, I'll tell you, at the end of the day, abstinence is much easier than moderation. And many patients eventually come round to this, that, wow, I can moderate my use of this drug, but it's exhausting and not worth it. So many people will ultimately decide that abstinence is the way to go. And as you know, in my own life, I practice abstinence from social media and from smartphones even. Like I don't really use a smartphone as a part of my everyday routine because I know it would be very hard for me to moderate. Nonetheless, this discussion of moderation is an important one because most people in their jobs and in their lives can't completely abstain from using a smartphone. Like it's completely embedded in their lives and in their jobs. They have to be available. I mean, part of it is the culture has collectively conspired to make that true. Like even students now, you have to go online every day just to find out what the school schedule is because they change it every day. They didn't used to do that, right? When they couldn't do it, they didn't do it. But now that they can, we're all sort of, subject to the constant checking. So, it's important to acknowledge that reality. And then the discussion of moderation is important and is essential, really, because we have to moderate. We can't abstain from these devices for the most part. And so then how to do that becomes the question.
It's really interesting when you put it that way and you start thinking about different addictions, such as alcohol, and then the AA method of treatment, where that is something theoretically that you can totally remove from your life versus somebody who's trying to battle a social media addiction where even if they do get rid of their smartphone, they're going to be around other people with their phones, checking their Facebook, checking their social media. And I'm sure we could give countless examples in both categories. But I can imagine for the person who can totally abstain from something like alcohol, if that was a previous addiction, how that would be a lot easier to put that away and wall that off in a way and move on. Not that it's easy. Yeah. I don't want to, obviously every addiction has its challenges. I don't want to belittle by any means, but there is that whole extra layer to some of these addictions where they're part of society. You have to see them every day and battle and overcome that addiction while being exposed to it.
Absolutely. And I think top of that list is pornography and compulsive masturbation. A man I was talking to who was in long-term recovery from pornography addiction, he said, the problem that we sex addicts face is that the bar, where you get your drinks is in our minds. And that's right. So when your drug is your own fantasy life and your body, you can't outrun those, right? There has to be a very different sort of approach. You can't just lock it up and put it away because it's with you all the time. And then you've got a society that's constantly priming you to think about sex, whether it's songs on the radio or advertisements for clothing or just the frank push notifications about pornography that come right into our, inboxes. It's just everywhere. Really, really hard.
Let's flip the switch here and talk about things from the other side of the spectrum, where somebody wants to go into the pain, and you've written extensively in your book on this, to have that pleasure afterwards. So up until this point, we've been talking about dopamine stimulating pleasure, and then the after effect of the pain, the tipping of the balance and having that period of pain afterwards. But what about an instance, and this is something that's really popular in my world, talking about cold water immersion or cold showers and experiencing pain in that way, but then feeling this euphoria after you come to the other side. So I'd love to talk about the reverse and how we can go about using that as a healthy way to, work with dopamine.
Yeah, so this is an exciting area of science called hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. And basically, it's the study of the ways in which the exposure to mild to moderate toxic stimuli is actually good for us. So if you think back to the pleasure-pain balance, remember when we ingest intoxicants, whether a substance or a behavior, we press on the pleasure side, we get dopamine released in the reward pathway, and the gremlins hop on the pain side of the balance. But what if we were to intentionally first press on the pain side? What do those gremlins do then? Well, the gremlins are agnostic to whatever the initial stimulus is. If we press on the pain side first by immersing ourselves in ice cold water, doing different forms of exercise, engaging in effortful mind-body work like meditation, prayer, martial arts, Tai Chi. Well, those gremlins, they will hop on the pleasure side and we will get our dopamine indirectly. And that indirect source of dopamine is a potentially more enduring source of dopamine, less vulnerable to the problem of addiction, although not entirely invulnerable to that problem. And the reason is because we're paying for our dopamine up front. So if you think about what intoxicants do, you get a spike in dopamine followed by free fall levels of dopamine, not just to baseline, but below baseline. That's the dopamine deficit state. And then eventually, if we stop, a return to baseline levels. But with things that are painful or difficult, or like ice cold water immersion or exercise, what you get is over the latter half of that activity, you get a gradual increase in dopamine levels. And then here's the exciting part. Those dopamine levels will remain elevated above baseline for hours afterwards before coming back down to baseline levels. And so there's no dopamine deficit state. Why? Because we did the work up front to get our dopamine. We got it indirectly, not directly. And so it's a potentially healthy source of dopamine. The problem is, as you and I have been discussing, that our world in managing to make everything addictive has also managed to make things like exercise addictive, work addictive. Ice cold water can be addictive if we up the ante and get colder and colder with, the technology that allows us to do that. So there is the risk of becoming addicted to pain. And of course, that's essentially what happens with cutters, people who cut on themselves. They do that because it releases endogenous endorphins, our own opioids, and essentially they're using opioids, but they're getting it indirectly. And that's not what we're talking about. That's not healthy and adaptive. The key message in hormesis is that it's mild to moderate exposure to noxious stimuli. It's very clear that if it's too much exposure to a noxious stimulus, the organism is injured or killed. So it's finding, that balance that creates the resilience. And essentially what's happening when we do that is that we're telling our bodies, oh, there's been a minor injury. We now need to start to upregulate endogenous production of feel-good hormones like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, our endogenous opioids, our endogenous cannabinoids. And that's what's happening then, right? Like we are upregulating our own kind of natural factories for making these healthy chemicals. But again, if we expose ourselves to too much pain all at once, then we're essentially telling our bodies, oh, this isn't just minor injury, like you're going to die. And so there's then the flooding of all of our stores of these chemicals, which of course then is followed by like this depleted state. And you see that not just with cutters, you see that with people who skydive. So people who skydive, they will get this incredible flooding of dopamine and other neurotransmitters. It's an amazing high. It can last for days. But what you see with people who skydive repeatedly over periods of time, they get anhedonic, where they essentially, it doesn't bump them at all anymore.
That is so interesting. And you touched on this before, and I didn't get a chance to dig into it. But let's talk more about that. People that are thrill seekers who are hitting that dopamine switch again and again, and not just in a moderate way, but at the highest intensity. Is there research that shows oftentimes these people day to day in their quote unquote monotony of their work and family life comparatively, do they tend to feel low and depressed?
So we definitely, there's data on that with skydivers, right? Where they compared skydivers, I think, to people who do crew or row, which is also an effortful, difficult sport. But it's something where it's exertional, and you're building up muscles. And so you get sort of the, let's say, rower's high without this anhedonia. But with skydivers, what it's the technology that allows skydiving to happen, right? And it's effortful in the sense you have to check your equipment, you have to get the plane, you got to go up there. But really, it's not. What happens is you're telling your body, like, oh, but I'm going to die. Like, I'm falling through, I'm going to die. So there's a rush of endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, just an absolute flooding, which is an incredible high. But it wanes, and then those people are often below normal mood levels, depressed and anhedonic. At least, that's what some of the literature show. In my own clinical experience, adrenaline junkies, that's real. It's often mixed with polypharmacy. So in my experience, people who are, addicted to adrenaline, sports, life-threatening situations in sports, they become immune to the effects of those sports. They have to up the ante, has to get more and more dangerous for them to be able to get a high from it. Then often they're mixing it with other drugs, alcohol or cannabis, and so it's very difficult. I was really interested in Alex Honnold, who free soloed El Capitan, and, the speculation about why he was able to do that. And people talked about, he was born with a smaller amygdala, so his fear processing is less, so he's just innately less afraid of things. But he had a panic attack when they were putting him in the MRI machine to actually visualize his amygdala. And so I don't think it's an innate difference. I think it's an acquired difference through the constant exposure, through the climbing that he's done over his entire life, where, what was scary initially is no longer scary because his brain has adapted to it.
And I'd have to imagine we could tie this back to what we were talking about earlier with performers and even non-extreme, but professional athletes, people that are performing in front of large crowds. Say they go and do that for 20 years and then they retire. You can only imagine the highs that they must have had and the dopamine spikes being in front of that many people cheering them on, and then to go to a more typical lifestyle. Is there any science showing what happens with those people when they scale back?
Oh, well, we see this all the time, the kind of come down from a career like that and having to adjust to sort of regular, boring, normal life. And the kind of, it's like being in withdrawal, right? It's really, really hard adjustment. But I think it would be wrong to assume that there's it's like a constant period of elation when they're at the top of their careers. And then it's this, sort of despondency when their career ends. I think even within that career of striving for those kinds of heights and having to perform and be on, there's all kinds of suffering going on there, just in terms of, yes, you have to be on, you get that high, but then right after the performance or after the event, there's a come down. Even within the performance of the event, there can be that come down. So it's struggling with that all that time, never really finding that balance or that equilibrium. And then, of course, when the career is over, then it's also then loss of identity issues, like who am I if I'm not this, amazing athlete who's winning these races or whatever it is. Those are all really tough things and really deeply intertwined with this reward cycle.
And I know you have to go, but one final thing I want to wrap up with here, and this ties back to the piece of pushing into pain to have that dopamine hit in what might be a healthier way. I'm curious, has there been any research showing for somebody who is battling addiction, using some of those processes, whether it be cold water therapy or exercise in a healthy way, to help re-regulate that dopamine back to baseline quicker than without those modalities?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for asking about that, because there's loads of research showing that exercise in the early withdrawal or early recovery period can speed up the process of recovery. can limit or shorten withdrawal, can make it more likely that folks will not relapse, so it'll make them more resilient in the face of triggers. And there's even a possibility that even before the development of addiction, that these types of hormetic or effortful activities, especially exercise, will prevent the development of addiction in the first place. So yeah, lots and lots of data, especially on exercise and its protective factors against addiction and the ways in which it can help people as they're trying to recover from addiction.
And again, I know you have to go. I'm going to link up Dopamine Nation in the show notes. I know you don't have social media, so we're not going to link that up, but we'll put everything we can in the show notes. And I really enjoyed the conversation. This was a really unique one compared to a lot of the different chats I've had over the years. And I really enjoyed it. And thank you for the work you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you. Now that you're done learning all about dopamine, you're going to want to stick around and catch my chat here with Dr. Stephen Hayes, where you're going to learn how to unlock your mind. I'll see you over there.
If you're living inside a cage that's made out of rice paper, and I know that it looks real, the bars look real, they're not real.